Good afternoon. My name is Gilbert Domit. I work in a consulting firm. We've been recently heavily involved in the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. I've been personally highly involved in that. We work on a few issues related to conflict, social cohesion, municipalities, localities. It is a very interesting topic we're going to tackle in this panel. In fact, there are at least 3 words that are not being used by the Lebanese government, and it's interesting that IFI has them in the agenda. One word is refugees. So the Lebanese government doesn't use the word refugees in its literature. So we're going to hear from you, like, why IFI is using it. Also, the word social cohesion. So also the Lebanese government is not using the word cohesion. It's using the social stability. And probably, behind these terms, a lot of policy conversations are happening. And the word vulnerabilities, it is being used, but also it's not strictly well defined by all partners. What do we mean by vulnerabilities? As you probably know, if you've been following on what's happening, the LCRP, the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan, will go out very soon. So probably the first draft in less than 10 days. A lot of, first it has been positively surprising, the level of collaboration, the level of responsiveness by the Lebanese government, by the different partners. I know some people might have different say. At the same time, it's quite challenging. It's a large operation. This is happening now real time within institutions. There are probably 3 levels of complexities. There is one level which is at the policy level. So a lot of policy decisions need to be made or have been made, but also need to be reviewed. But because of the stalemate in the political system, it's not allowing these policy decisions to be made as easy, such as things probably we're going to tackle now, social stability, livelihood, also in terms of roles of government versus partners. There's a level of coordination, so there are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of players. And the 3rd level is implementation and the partners and what's happening. So when we talk about vulnerability, shelter, social cohesion, we have very alarming numbers. And probably I'll leave it to the panelists to share some of these numbers. They are very alarming and require a very fast but smart response at the same time. So we'll start our panel with the first speaker. So we have Ahmed Qasim will not be presenting. He apologized, probably because there is a lot of pressure on finalizing the strategies. So the first panel will be with Aline Rahbani. It's about social cohesion between urban refugees and host communities. Just a quick brief, Aline has been working in humanitarian and development fields, focusing on urban programming with World Vision International, in Lebanon, in the Middle East, also Eastern Europe, and she's been as well most recently in a global urban advisor portfolio. Aline's back is in public health and her passion is for urbanism. She found the perfect environment to do both. So Aline, so probably is it 15 minutes? Where is Layla? 20 minutes? Okay, so okay, so 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you, Gilbert. Good afternoon. In the past couple of days, I was attending the the World Vision Lebanon Strategy Revision meeting. And in one of the small group discussions, over the span of 1 hour only, I counted the term social cohesion being used 64 times. So what's social cohesion and why does it matter? Fact is, there is not a widely held, theoretically derived, clearly articulated, and reasonably operationalized definition of social cohesion. We loosely define social cohesion as the nature and set of relationships between individuals and groups in a particular environment. So we're calling that horizontal social cohesion, and between those individuals and groups and institutions that govern them, and we're calling that the vertical social cohesion. What we know is that changing and multiple identities along the lines of political, religious, ethnic, and social affiliations interfere with social cohesion. We also know that social cohesion requires an understanding of social networks, complex web of interconnected relationships, internal to groups and in between groups. Some of the indicators of social cohesion include aspects of personal, political, development, human security, trust in institutions, satisfaction and participation in civic life, measures of intergroup perceptions, perceived threats. But for organizations like us who are interested in low social cohesion or in social tensions, we also look at the manifestations of low social cohesion, which are social tensions, social instability, and social fragmentation that can be measured using indicators like violent intergroup incidents, harassment, bullying, scapegoating, but also communication of negative feelings. So having this in mind, why are we talking about social cohesion in strategy meetings? More than 4 years of civil war in Syria has generated a massive, protracted displacement of over 7 million internally displaced and 4 million refugees who are now living in urban, non-camp situations in countries like Lebanon and Jordan. This is causing new and diverse challenges to authorities, to humanitarian actors, and to receiving host communities, because it wasn't dealt with in the same way previously in case of migration and refugees. Usually they are placed in remote, secluded area in camps. Now it's not the case. The influx of refugees in Lebanon is contributing to a situation of rapid and unsustainable urbanization in an already fragile context. So the situation has worsened existing vulnerabilities and increased pressure on under-equipped and underfunded local municipalities. They're not able to provide basic urban services to their communities, and now with the Syria crisis, this has exacerbated. Because the urban context is characterized by fluid, diverse, interconnected communities, underlying structural vulnerabilities can intensify inequality, resource scarcity, competition, social conflict. So it's no surprise that the tensions have emerged between the refugees and host communities and between local communities and the institutions that govern them. Studies now show that rising social tensions between communities have multiple critical consequences, and I will talk about 2 of them. The first one, they have potential to generate a secondary conflict in host country. So increasingly, Lebanese nationals are becoming concerned about being victims of crime, about being thrown back into poverty, about service shortages, about radicalization of refugees and increasing terrorism. And in some cases, those tensions and resentment and animosity and hostility are turning into violence toward refugees, including scapegoating, harassment, discrimination, curfews, vandalism, you can name it. This increases vulnerability and hinders the enjoyment of public city space and reduces mobility within the city, further compromising social cohesion. Second consequence, rising social tensions also have huge consequences on equitable access to public spaces, urban governance, access to basic services, livelihood opportunities, and humanitarian and development aid. So I'll give you one example. As tensions rise, so does too the isolation of refugee families from the fabric of the urban social life. Syrian women preferring to remain home to avoid harassment or negative scapegoating in public spaces. This unfortunate coping mechanism reduces access to social capital in the communities. Also children, they are adversely affected as families prefer not to send their children to school in avoidance of them being discriminated against or harassed, which in turn increases segregation and further social tensions. It's also widely held that humanitarian and development interventions can directly or indirectly contribute to the increased tensions in communities. Poorly planned aid can contribute to increased division between competing groups and undermine local conflict resolution institutions and exacerbate power inequalities. In urban environments, for example, displaced communities often reside alongside the non-displaced, the host communities, and they are equally poor and equally vulnerable and marginalized. And their complex, heavily monetized systems mean that health, education, housing, and food are deeply embedded in market systems' responses efforts. Health, education, housing, and food are deeply embedded in market systems. So the response efforts that aid organizations do can no longer be sector or beneficiary-centric. Opportunities exist. New research suggests that refugee economies can positively contribute to the environments generating vibrant, thriving economic systems that humanitarian programming could unlock. Ways to enable those economic systems to be channeled to the benefit of the refugees. Finally, as Gilbert was saying, humanitarian organizations operating in Lebanon may not have a choice if they wish to remain relevant, because social cohesion or stability has been articulated as a strategic priority in regional and national response plans. So what have we done in World Vision over the course of the past year? We've embarked on a lengthy process of trying to answer two questions. First one is, how is social cohesion in urban settings in Lebanon and Jordan currently understood? Second question is, how is social cohesion currently operationalized in a context of the Syria response? We started what we called a multi-year action learning project, and what I'm sharing with you today is the findings of the first phase of this project, which is a literature review that can help us identify gaps that come and accordingly come up with evidence-based program design to further exploration through direct implementation and continued research. We identified 625 sources and then narrowed them down to 66 prioritized documents with a set of criteria that we developed. So the literature review is not meant to be an exhaustive study, but it's a guiding framework for approaching the topic of social cohesion in humanitarian emergency response settings. We looked at 15 key initiatives by international organizations, and those initiatives did seek to quantify matters of social cohesion between Syrian refugees and host communities. We wanted to be able to determine the primary drivers of tensions. Then we moved to explore how is the humanitarian community currently engaging with social cohesion, so including donor governments, host country governments, and municipalities, through reviewing regional, national, and organizational strategies. And the last part, which I'm not going to elaborate on much today, is the part where we looked internally at our own organization to see our regional and national strategies, our programming approaches, and our existing tools within the organization. How much are they able to facilitate social cohesion or to increase tensions? So what did we find out? The review of the 15 key initiatives that I talked about allowed us to understand the drivers of social tensions, and it was mentioned in the first panel today, the last from Dr. Naame, about the pre-existing vulnerabilities that the country is suffering from and how the Syria response is not the main factor contributing to the poverty that we have in the country. So we were able to determine the drivers into three main categories. The first one is structural causes, which is the vulnerabilities that predate the Syria crisis, high level of poverty, resource scarcity, and lack of effective governing institutions. The second one being socioeconomic causes, so refugees and host communities have different religious, cultural, social norms and lack of social networks. And the third one, which is the proximate cause, is the one that is resulting from demographic shifts driven by massive displacement. And this includes access, affordability, and quality of housing, economic competition over jobs and livelihood opportunities, access to and quality of basic education, and basic public goods and services such as electricity, water, waste management. Role of international aid and role of social, local, and international media in framing the issues. Why is it important to conceptualize those drivers? Because those drivers could be the entry points for mitigating or diffusing tensions. So such categorization should be at the center when we're planning different interventions to address the issue. In addition to this, we learned that history and context are crucial. Again, the context of Lebanon, past events, sectarian and political identities, so existing vulnerabilities that were there before the Syria crisis happened. Second, we learned that social cohesion requires thinking beyond refugee and host community dynamics. So as social cohesion, I explained in the beginning, it's vertical and horizontal. Social tensions are vertical and horizontal. And it's important to understand that the drivers of tension at the micro level, such as competition over economic livelihood and employment and housing challenges, those are tensions that generate horizontal tensions between the communities, whereas the factor at the macro level, such as the access to and quality of public services, those contribute to vertical tensions, so between the local communities and the institutions that govern them. Framing is also important. Experience isn't everything. So what's the influence that media might have on matters of social cohesion in host countries? In one of the studies that we looked at, it illustrated how increasing contact with people back home through social media and exposure to local and international media significantly influences attitude toward violence among increasingly isolated Syrian refugees and host communities. 4, perception of humanitarian assistance matters. Understanding those perceptions is especially useful for aid agencies to begin thinking about how their response is intimately linked between two community dynamics and may catalyze frictions, escalate tensions, and increase negative perceptions of assistance. 5, external factors also matter. So one of the studies presented the security focus by investigating regulatory incidents such as curfews that municipalities put, and discussing the securitization of Syrian community as perceived by Lebanese nationals. The study captured different manifestations of social tensions, but also it presented external factors that affect security, including that events in Syria, as well as clashes between Syrian conflict actors and the Lebanese armed forces, could impact inter-community perceptions as well. So all of those studies that we looked at did have some kind of gap in the design and in methodologies, and somewhere in the sampling methods used, and they were mostly cross-sectional snapshots. They didn't help us in determining causal relationships and correlations. And unfortunately, we think that this kind of limitations lead to research that perpetuates sector-based thinking and vague or ambitious recommendations. So what does it mean? What does all of this mean for us as humanitarian agencies and for you as academics and in other portfolios? For humanitarian actors, we need to improve our programming approaches to social cohesion. First recommendation is to adopt cross-sector, area-based approaches in urban non-camp setting, largely focused on supporting local municipalities and local organizations to provide public goods and services like education, health, and water, and housing to all vulnerable members of the society. So in 2 words, it means stop refugee-centric interventions and stop sector-centric interventions and move to a more area-based approach. Empower local actors by working with both refugees and host communities to create equitable solutions to alleviate tension over distribution. Be sensitive to tension over resources as well as over identity, territory, and security, which includes a call for a greater communication, transparency, and accountability from humanitarian agencies to all groups in the community. And finally, liaise with community leadership and security officials where tensions exist in order to resolve disputes and settle tensions arising from service provision, access, and economic competition. For academia and think tanks, we need to strengthen our social cohesion research. We need to develop a multidisciplinary approach to understanding social cohesion in urban, conflict-affected humanitarian settings. We need to be able to quantify key drivers of social tensions, conduct more in-depth longitudinal research on the impact of matters of reduced social cohesion across multiple vulnerable demographics. And here I focus on children, youth, women, persons with disability who are largely excluded from this research. Or conduct research on the role of faith-based social networks in matter of social cohesion in urban conflict-affected settings with protracted displacement issues. And finally, highlight positive case studies, or at least variation in the level of tension and vulnerability, or case studies of good practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Shall we take questions right after or after the 3? What do you prefer? After the 3? Huh? Yeah, okay. Just to pick on what Aline just said. So we're looking at 3 drivers of social tensions. Just to reflect this on what's happening now. So when we're talking about like structural, economic, or proximity, and why we're changing social cohesion, replacing it with social stability, is it a result or a process? Shall social stability be mainstreamed across all sectors so that the result would be social stability? Or shall we focus on social cohesion as one strategy, means intervention to deal with these drivers of tension on a local level? And this is a discussion that is not solved yet between the different stakeholders. There is another issue that comes when we're looking at these drivers of tensions. We're looking at, if we want to deal with the drivers, some of them government is not equipped to deal with, means dealing with poverty or the governance system. Or if we're talking about socioeconomic livelihood, are we giving livelihood for Syrians or not? So if we decide that we want to deal with the drivers and mainstream it, this means that we need to have the right policy for each sector that would ensure social stability. Or if we want to tackle it directly, other issues come on the front. Means, are we reducing it only to cultural issues? Can we do it through municipalities when we know that more than 57% of municipalities are not equipped, have no administration, no capacity, very small, 70% are very small to deal with any of these issues? Another issue, here we're talking about are we talking also about social cohesion between Lebanese, Syrian, Lebanese, because also there are some observations that there's an increase of tension between Syrians and not only between Syrian and Lebanese. I'm not talking about the Lebanese issue. The urban construct, also the camps and non-camps. There are some studies recently that were out that says in no camp is better, a comparison between Lebanon and Jordan, I don't know if you've seen it, that says in no camp would allow better informal social safety nets and thus better access. So now also there is this debate around this issue. I'll close with research issues. One of the reluctance of the Lebanese government and other stakeholders for social cohesion means not only as mainstreaming it is, can we prove that all these interventions to build better social relations, dynamics, and are these effective? Can anyone prove, have data, not qualitative, quantitative, that yes, if we do conflict prevention or early warning or cultural diversity, is it effective? So there is no proof. Linking it to also the urban level, we've seen Bergby. She's the planning for, the topic is about planning for an inclusive urban response. Seen is currently the program planning advisor in UN Habitat Lebanon. She's leading their 4-city program, called 4-City Program. Previously, she chaired the Norwegian NGO Habitat Norway and worked at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo. She has a bachelor and master's in architecture and urban planning from the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and an undergraduate degree from the Oslo University College and Development Studies. So her research studies focus on urban mapping, informality, diploma on use of online mapping. Seen, the floor is yours. 20 minutes, 15.
Yeah, I do have a presentation.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to speak on behalf of UN Habitat in this event. As Ahmed Kazim was not able to join us today from Mosa, I will try to fill in some of the information I suspect he would have informed you, because I made my presentation on the basis that he would have already given that presentation. So I will try to fill in the gaps in between here. So I will talk about UN Habitat's program and how we try to program our work to respond to the Syrian refugee crisis in an inclusive urban response, and the tool that we developed to do that. But I will also try to explain some of the research that we've done on the crisis impact on the cities. So as I said, we have a set of tools where we try to map the impact on the cities. What is the effect of the influx into poor urban communities? What does it mean with the density that you have in certain neighborhoods now? And then urban vulnerabilities and risks. And on the second hand, what do we do to respond to this? We're building the capacity of local authorities to respond to the needs, both meeting the needs of refugee and host populations, and developing adequate and integrated response modalities. So in the fourth city program, I will explain a little bit more why we call it the fourth city program. But basically what we're looking at there is city and village profiling, it's neighborhood profiling, and it's neighborhood upgrading strategies. First, a little bit on our perceptions. Helena already mentioned it a little bit, but this is quite crucial. How do we perceive the crisis, and what kind of tools do we have to understand what is the impact on the cities? So one thing, as was just mentioned, so in Lebanon there is no established camps for the Syrian refugees. This is linked to the previous established Palestine refugee camps. Understandably so, the government was not too willing to establish new camps. However, just because a refugee is not in a camp doesn't make the refugee an urban refugee. But in Lebanon, the refugees are in fact actually living in urban areas. So that's why we call them urban refugees in Lebanon. This map behind me here is the map that basically the whole humanitarian community is using to define where should we go, where are the highest vulnerabilities. And you can see in Bekaa, in Akkar, in Hermel, it's marked out. This is like the key areas that we need to address because of the magnitude of the displacement to this area and the stress on the host communities based on the poverty levels in the host communities. This is all fine and well, and we in UN Habitat we agree to this understanding. However, this map look at the ratio between refugee population and host population. So in one municipality or one cadastre, you could have 5,000 Syrian refugees, but you have 2,000 Lebanese population, and therefore that will be marked out as highly vulnerable. That doesn't describe the difference between a large area in Bekaa with a certain amount of refugees compared to, for instance, Tripoli with 70,000 Syrian refugees. So here I will try to wing in a little bit what Ahmed would have talked about. In the shelter response, we have a set of response modalities. That's based on the shelter typologies of where the Syrian refugees reside. Just also underline that actually our response plan also include Palestine refugees. It does include Lebanese host communities, but of course the attention has been most on the Syrian refugees over the last 4 or 5 years. So as you see from the shelter survey in 2015, which is quite similar to the previously shelter surveys, is that the far majority lives in apartments, houses. And then you have 18% in informal tented settlements. And this is quite funny because, I mean, I think we all, and at least outside this room, everybody perceive that the refugees are in tents in Bekaa, in agricultural fields. But that's a quite small percentage. And then you have a quite big percentage that lives in substandard buildings, such as unfinished houses, in garages, workshops, etc. So the question here is, where does those refugees outside tented settlements live? We have exact location on all informal tented settlements. We know a number of tents, we know a number of people. We have the whole structure. While for the 80% living outside informal tented settlements, we don't have that information. However, we know that Lebanon is 87% urbanized, so the likelihood of the refugees living outside an agricultural area to live in an urban area is quite big. So what we've been working on in UN Habitat is also to then look at where are the actual population living. So in this map you see, I don't know how clear it is for you, but I mean, the purple circles are the Syrian refugees as of March. This has been quite stable this year. The Palestine refugees are marked out in blue, and the host population in the green sublayer. So you can see by this mapping that the concentration is very much along the urban belt, along the coast, and a big concentration in the largest cities. In the largest cities, you find 30% of the refugees, and by that I mean the 4 largest cities. So that's Tripoli, Beirut, Saida, and Tyr. And in these 4 cities, you capture more or less 50% of the total population. So that's why we developed a program to look at the 4 largest cities. It's not that we disregarded the rest of the cities, but that's really where there is a lot of pressure. And that's also the 4 cities that basically host all the Palestinian refugees, and as well, a far majority of the Lebanese under $4 a day are concentrated in the urban areas. So, and then in addition, this year there were some new restrictions put forward on the Syrian refugees. So you're not allowed to work, you need to provide a certain set of documents to be able to extend your visa, increasing the likelihood that more refugees try to go under the radar because they don't have those $200 to pay for the extension. They don't have the documents they need to provide. And also, of course, as was just described, there's increase of tension in communities. And that increases the likelihood that you will not remain in a small village. You are likely to go to a larger urban area where you can also enter the larger informal economy and the informal housing market more easily. And this follows the urbanization pattern globally. So this is not unique to Lebanon, but Lebanon is already a very urbanized country. And also to say that 3 out of 4 main economic sectors, the construction sector, tourism, service industry, is also concentrated in the cities. You're not likely to stay in a remote village in Bekaa if the aid drops, if you can go to the city and start working informally. So one of the tools that we developed is to look at the largest cities, to really analyze what kind of population are we talking about, what is the impact, what is the risks, what are the vulnerabilities. The first profile will be more directed to the humanitarian community, really to highlight we need more support in the cities and we need also more engagement from the government and ministries on urban response. The first profile we started with was the Tripoli Rapid City Profile. This will be published soon, so we will communicate that as well.
Fresh from the oven. Fresh from the oven.
Exactly. This report, you heard the presentation of Adenauer, so these kind of assessments and research already done that's embedded into this profile. So that's the first thing that we do, is to really map out which existing reports and assessments are available. But we try really to understand that data in a spatial manner. So first thing is to map out the data. The areas that we look at is often a more larger metropolitan area rather than just the city and the municipality city. And this is already a key aspect as to how we understand the cities and the impact on the cities, because the cities and the municipalities are not well equipped to actually plan for the actual urban area of the city. They have their boundaries, and then to start to discuss outside that boundary is very difficult. It's very difficult to start talking with Beirut municipality, which we know all have quite many money and quite a big sum of money in their bank, to also address issues in Bud Shamoud or the southern suburbs. The same for Tripoli, although in Tripoli they have also urban observatory under the Union of Municipalities, which is more functioning. So this is the one thing to define what are the area that we're talking about. And then the population. The Syrian refugees, we have the registration data. And we all know that the numbers are probably much likely quite higher than the registration data, especially in the cities. But for Tripoli, we're talking about almost 70,000 Syrian refugees, in addition to 35,000 Palestinian refugees, both living here for quite a long time and also from Syria. And then you have the host population. So amongst the Lebanese, what is actual population? The data that we sit on is from 1997, and we know, of course, that the population has increased since then. So just by using the World Bank growth rate, we come up with a quite different number. It increases by almost 100,000 just in Tripoli. So for the local authorities, it's not 260,000 to plan for, but it's actually almost 500,000 when you start looking at the estimation that we can come up with quite simple means. And then we're not looking at, for instance, urbanization rate over the last 10 years or something. So then, in addition, looking at the vulnerability rates in a city such as Tripoli, the far majority of the population lives under the poverty line. And of course, that needs some quite different response, both on the humanitarian side, but also from national and local government. This is just a display, and I'm not sure if Adib showed you any maps earlier today, but I mean, the concentration is also in certain specific neighborhoods. And that's something that we try to really map out and go into those neighborhoods. And then we will start looking at, okay, which areas do we develop a more detailed neighborhood profile as well. So the city profile looks at some different sectors as well, which is interesting for the humanitarian response, but it's also interesting for the local authorities to understand the impact of the crisis. As I said, building on the available data, for instance, from ESCWA and UNDP, etc. And then we zoom in and try to identify where are the risks and vulnerabilities concentrated. And then we go into the neighborhood profiling, where we do a very detailed spatial analysis inside buildings, inside the neighborhoods. We also try to not only understand the services inside the houses and the infrastructure, but also what are the perceived boundaries, where do you go for services, and what are the kind of services that you can be provided from the local authorities. In the Tripoli profile, we're zooming in on Tabena and Jabal Mossem because there's both, of course, there's a high tension level, but also because there's a lot of available data. So from the available data, we can go directly into really understanding the spatial dynamics of what it means that you have an extra 20,000, 30,000 refugees moving into this specific area. As I said, so the selection is due to the already tension, information, and data availability, and of course also access for our side. And going back again to the perception, this is also important when we zoom in on neighborhoods, because you have the more formal maps, but they don't really display the actual reality on the ground. So when we zoom in on the neighborhoods, we can really go into a much more in-depth analysis of what the density inside the structures are. Because in the urban areas, you don't have that camp-like or informal tented settlements, horizontal spread of the refugees. They moved into the existing structures. So while in many of the areas with informal tented settlements, we talk about affected host communities. You have the tented settlement here, and you have the host community living in a village here. Obviously, they are impacted by the crisis, but it's something quite different when everybody lives in the same building. And that's something that we really need to understand, that this is also an urban humanitarian crisis, which is to a large extent not responded to. And as I said, looking much more closely into the social fabric, and this is where our predefined humanitarian sector response doesn't really fit to our urban response, because you need to understand this dynamics between neighborhoods and between communities. And the second tool that we developed in UN Habitat is something that we're building on from the 2006 response. So this is a technical unit that we install in unions and municipalities. It's a very practical way of responding to the emerging pressure on municipalities and unions and municipalities, and try to increase their capacity in responding to the need by enhancing their strength to response. So the regional technical offices is a unit comprising of engineers, architects, surveyors, mappers, and they will either go into a more city-like environment, or they will work in a union municipalities, but usually concentrated around the urban centers. And they will map out basically all the strain on the services, and they will prepare very practical technical documents so that whoever partners are working, operating in that area can actually directly go to the municipalities and the unions and implement their projects through those entities rather than having a big set of actors implementing bits and pieces here and there on their own. So it's a coordination mechanism as well, and it brings the local authorities back to the behind the wheel to steer the development inside their area. And this, of course, also goes back to what you talked about. There is more than 1,000 municipalities. Their capacity is quite weak. However, there is 53 unions of municipalities. Even though they don't cover all territories in Lebanon, they do cover the larger part where you have a concentration of Syrian refugees. So for us, it's quite much easier number to address 53 units than 1,000. And it also doesn't make sense to build the technical capacities of more than 1,000 municipalities. It's not economically sound, and it's not a normal way of planning, because the geographical size of a municipality is very small. So, as I said, this builds on our 2006 response. This is a little bit on the sizes. It's also easier for the municipalities to allocate money to one shared unit under the unions rather than allocate those funds for themselves. And this, of course, also builds on the revenues that they get from the state, which is very limited. So this is a little bit again on the activities of the RTOs. I think I stop here, and then I can come back with some more. I want to go through the questions.
Thank you, Seen. Very interesting tools, and I think this could feed a lot into policy in the coming phase. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I read somewhere, is that true that 41% of Syrian refugees live in highly substandard housing shelters? There's 9.15 in highly overcrowded, and 4.1% are at risk of eviction.
We don't have actually a percentage for who's at risk on eviction, but from more or less the same time of year last year till now, the number of informal tent settlements, for instance, increased from 1,500 to 3,000 because of evictions. You have the larger settlements were evicted and then spread out, and they established new informal tent settlements. In the urban areas, this is much harder to map out, and that's of course also a little bit the knowledge amongst the refugees and where to go and register their eviction threats. But with the 18% living in informal tent settlements, and then you have 22% living in substandard buildings, you also have a quite big percentage of those living in apartments that live in severely overcrowded conditions. So we estimate maybe 18% out of the almost 60% living in apartments living in then substandard conditions because they are sharing very small spaces.
Mm-hmm. Just also to build on that, the two concerns that we hear often from government partners is one is coexistence. So when you're talking about urban and shelter, so if Lebanese cannot coexist, are we going to coexist between Lebanese and Syrians? So this is one concern, how much integration within the urban construct should they be involved? Another one is security. So what is better managed and how to better manage it from a security perspective? And we look in certain areas, sometimes by default of chaos. So sometimes we see Syrian settlements, Syrian groupings at the tangent of an urban space, and sometimes totally integrated. Depends on the landscape, or depends on which village they came to. Also, it really differs from one village to another, and how to deal with it. Might not be able to have one way of dealing with shelter and urban.
No, but I mean, what we see is that in the poorest areas of the largest cities, there is almost a doubling of the population in some areas. So, of course, this will increase the tension. Not because there is necessarily a tension between refugees and host population, but because everybody has less electricity, everybody pays more for potable water, and everybody has more sewage around them in the basement, in the streets, and everything. So, I mean, I would be frustrated, and of course you are frustrated if you can't pay your rent and you can't send your children to school. So that's, I mean, that's not rocket science, but we still talk about the urban response as a stabilization part of what we're doing, while the humanitarian response happening in informal tent settlements. And that's, of course, what we are trying to argue, is that this is an urban humanitarian crisis, but our tools are very well fitted to a camp-like setting, or to think as this would be a camp, which is what we deploy in informal tent settlements. However, the tools doesn't fit to the urban response, and then therefore we kind of start talking about stabilization or resilience, and it doesn't matter. I mean, that's just wording. What matters is that people actually becoming poorer.
Thank you, Seen. We're moving to our third intervention. So it's about ordinary practices of the public spaces by the urban poor, insights from the study of the settlements of refugees in Beirut's suburbs, with Marianne Madore. She's a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris with a master's in urban policies and in sociology. So this presentation is based on her thesis, effectively. She's teaching economics and political sciences in high school in the south of Lebanon, an experience in urban planning agency Takwin in Cairo, investment accommodation for the French Development Agency, in regards of the inclusion of marginalized workers in the job market in Mozambique. Marianne, the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Thank you. I'm afraid it's going to be disappointed because it's not an alarming presentation. I will skip the general introduction on the refugee situations, given that we've got two very interesting presentations, and I'm building on the definition you gave of social cohesion. This presentation today aims at bringing into the debate the question of urban public spaces. I argue that to understand the social dynamics at play in urban settings, one needs to look at the interaction taking place daily on the outdoor public spaces between the members of the different communities. Specifically, in some neighborhoods of the suburbs of Beirut, more than 2/3 of the residents are now Syrian refugees. So of course, their arrival, what we just heard, triggered deep perturbation for the local communities at many levels. And the local international newspapers have extensively covered a few episodes of violence involving refugees. NGO, UN agencies produced countless precious reports on the situation, highlighting the tensions between refugees and host communities. My research takes on a different direction in the sense that the aim is not to explain the disorder, the troubles, and the disruptions. These aspects are not overlooked, but rather looked at from a different angle. Given the exceptional degree of perturbation, given the difficulties, the pressures, how can one explain the relative peacefulness so far in the settlement areas? What are the mechanisms that allowed the absorption of hundreds of thousands of people in a very short period without leading, still so far, to massive unrest? In the course of my research, I identified obviously a combination of various factors to explain this social peace linked to the specific history and relations between the different communities, their identities, the support of the NGOs. Today, I will focus on the impact of public spaces. I will start with reading an extract from the notebook I was carrying around when I conducted my research. It was mid-February 2015, and the rain had finally stopped after a week of storm. In Lebanon, each storm that hits the country is named by the meteorologists. We had Zina in January, Gina in February, Johan in late February. Naming makes it sound extraordinary and attracts the attention of the media. Between two of these exceptional storms, an unnoticeable scene is taking place in front of one of the new schools for refugee children in Bor Shamoud, in the eastern suburbs of Beirut. Mothers, fathers, aunts are waiting for the children with trolleys filled by the children that could not be enrolled in the school. The doorman of the school opened the doors at noon. Children from the age of 11 to the age of 15 gets out the schoolyards. The girls look older than the boys. That's often the case at this age. And today, loud voices can be heard. One boy has an argument with a girl. He starts shouting. She starts shouting. Parents intervene. The doorman asks them to calm down. 2 minutes after, parents go back to their conversation about the storms. When I started fieldwork in the suburbs of Beirut, I was naively surprised by the countless ordinary moments I witnessed. This presentation today is based on the research I conducted for my master's thesis in urban policy and sociology, so last year for University in Paris, and was fruitful academic affiliation here at AUB. So in the next 10-15 minutes, I'll briefly introduce the methodology and then present this case study, and then go through a few findings that I'll also be very happy to discuss. I relied mostly on qualitative data collected through extended period of observation, volunteering in local organization, interviews with long-term residents, refugees, families, community leaders, NGO workers, police, municipal officers. I worked in the eastern suburbs of Beirut, and I think this is important to underline, without trying to blindly extend the findings related to the specific case study to the whole country, but rather with the ambition that the mechanisms that I identify would contribute to a more sophisticated understanding of the settlement patterns and realities of the urban poor. So the case study I chose is the municipality of Bor Shamoud. I'm sorry, the map that you can see is not updated, but it's about 20,000 refugees were registered there by UNHCR since 2011. And it is one of the highest percentage of refugees compared to the local population in the whole metropolitan area of Beirut. So between 15 and 20%, again, depending on the numbers you want to trust. And in addition, this case study was, this location was also chosen because Syrian refugees who settled in this municipality, according to UNHCR, are among the most vulnerable urban dwellers in Lebanon. In May 2014, on the 18th, an argument between two groups of young men in Bor Shamoud ended with a gas tank, this gas bottle being thrown from the second floor of a residential building and hit someone in the street below. The event, again, was extensively covered by the media. But a few days after, situation went back to normal and newspapers left. So 4 years after the beginning of the crisis, this presentation aims at looking at ordinary human traffic and ordinary social contacts. I argue that to understand this social piece, despite the very fast demographic change, it can be very fruitful to look at interaction on outside public spaces. And specifically the mechanisms of control from mostly from the receiving communities, but also the mechanisms of learning and gradual appropriation by the refugees. So this is what I'm going to introduce now. So first, controlling, policing, normalizing. July 2014, municipality of Bor Shamoud, like many others, announced the implementation of a curfew on Syrian refugees from 7 in the evening to 7 a.m. and during a few weeks, then would not be able to just be in the streets. Syrian refugees were warned by large odds hanged on the walls in the streets. The word in Arabic for curfew, manat tajawul, it literally translates into the interdiction of wandering. The objective is explicit, banning the undesirable from the public space. It restricts the right to be present in open, unwalled public space, such as the mere presence of a Syrian refugee. It becomes improper. Because of the confusing explanations that were given to me by local officials as regards the implementation of this curfew, I was systematically asking all my informants, Lebanese or Syrian or other nationalities, if they were living under a curfew. And I obtained as many responses as informant. Yes, no, it depends, I don't know. Somehow these inconsistencies might stem from the fact that also informal militias were regulating the outdoor space. And so the boundaries are sometimes blurred between what is official and informal policing of the space. The actual control of the outdoor space is not necessarily done by the police and the official security forces, not all the time, not everywhere, not on every Syrian national. Follows a flexible pattern. And the curfew, and this is something I want to underline as well, is also an instrument of communication, a sign sent to local residents. When the first Syrian refugees arrived, the few public spaces in Beirut, which had been under constant surveillance already, became more regulated. In the summer 2014, the Garden of Sanaye, not far from here, opened after many years of renovation. Local residents reported their fear to see the Syrian use the parks and complain from their presence. At the entrance of the park, a large board warns the users about the requested behavior inside the park. It's forbidden to smoke, to picnic, to play football. They are notified that if they circumvent the rules, they would be evicted. In Burj Hamoud as well, the arrival of refugees led to stricter regulations of the municipal public park, which is just under the bridge, the Yerevan Bridge, and 2 municipal agents were posted at the entrance gate, agents that passively filtered the flows. So this is the first mechanism I wanted to put out, the second one being social learning. The idea is that the social stability in Burj Hamoud is not only caused by this policing, but also can be explained by the fact that newcomers gradually learn about the new environment through the practice of public spaces. The unknown host city, so Beirut in our cases, always trigger fears and distress. Refugees arrived with obviously little of their belongings, but many preconceived ideas about Beirut, about Lebanon. So many times I listened to their stories, like Hassan, who told me he was so surprised to see, women here, how they dressed, oh man, it's like Las Vegas, or people drinking in the streets. If you want to generalize a bit, you could say that before fleeing their country, most of the Syrian refugees had never been in Lebanon, and their knowledge about daily life here in the Lebanese capital was restricted to pop culture references or the stories told by Syrian acquaintances that would work in Beirut or Lebanon and then come back to Syria. And many of the stories were related to sexual episodes. And this is not to be overlooked, I believe, because then on the public space, once they arrived in Lebanon, so public space such as commercial streets, public gardens, school courtyards, refugees discover new realities. A social worker once told me that, but there's no dialogue here. People only look at each other, they sniff each other, but they do not talk to each other. And this remark was made on a sad, jaded tone. Yet much of the social peace in Burj Hamoud, I believe, could be explained by this distant mutual observation. By looking at each other, urban dwellers, either long-term residents or Syrian refugees, practice what some sociologists called folk ethnography. Outside public spaces encourage learning on the other and learning from the other by creating small and repeated interactions. So you can think about someone going shopping at the souk. Thanks to this repeated interaction, this very up-close observation, listening to people in the bus, they start making sense of the other. The sort of informal study of the people by the people, or performed by all residents. I cannot go through all the examples I have, but old Armenians, young refugees, Portuguese housekeepers, they all do it. And the consequences of such a folk ethnography is, I believe, a smoother cohabitation between the refugees and the residents who are literally gradually getting used to each other. The last ideas, the last mechanism I want to point out to try to explain social peace is the idea that public spaces enable the refugees refugees who went through a traumatic journey to reconnect with normal daily life in a city context and to learn how to navigate safely within the city. Every single day of fieldwork gave me access to scene or conversation of ordinary moment taking place on the public spaces. You have the unemployed male Syrian sitting on the plastic chairs in the streets drinking coffee. You have Syrian youth shopping for clothes at Suq al-Ahad. You have Syrian refugee parents waiting for their children to get out of school, mother talking about the weather, the teenager in the bus. Gradually, refugees' lives become a succession of ordinary moments. They know which food market they should go to get better deals. They know how to catch the bus, what's the number of the bus. One long-term resident, Armenian from Borchamoud, once told me that if you're not from the neighborhood, it looks like it's all the same in Borchamoud. But if you're from the neighborhood, you move based on a lot of landmarks that are around, churches or schools. So I think what I identify is that refugees learned gradually to locate the mosques, the knesset, the bridge, the municipal square, the police station, then the second mosque. And so they can locate themselves in relation to these landmarks. And my last point is on the anonymity that is given by this large metropolis that is Beirut. Anonymity that becomes a precious asset. In the streets and buses of Borchamoud, more than anywhere, I believe, in the city, the rich variety in the appearance of people offer a certain degree of anonymity. People can hide in the crowd. You have a group of Ethiopian ladies, you have Sudanese teenager, you have entirely veiled Shia women. And so Syrian refugees become unnoticeable. They're protected under the film of anonymity. This is an expression from a French anthropologist that I really like. The film of anonymity allows a coexistence of thousands of inhabitants that nothing would be possible without it. Many times informants said, oh, Borchamoud, you will find everything, Sunni, Christian, Lebanese, Syrian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan. And so, thanks to this envelope of anonymity, they're able to navigate and acquire the necessary skills to engage in city life. They learn how not to attract undue attention and keep within the spirit of the situation in order not to be de trop, not to be out of space. A Syrian worker who had been working on and off in Borchamoud before the events for over 10 years, he once told me that Syrians change color. They have to go with the color so that they can survive. And I thought that this expression was quite telling. I just want to conclude now with just a short anecdote. It was once in one of the main streets in Naba, which is one of the neighborhoods in Borchamoud, where now a lot of Syrian refugees living. I was with Noura, who was Lebanese Shia, and she was telling me, oh, look at this shop. It's the last Lebanese grocery shop in the street. And then she lowered her voice and she said, look, this is a Syrian shop, this is a Syrian shop, this is a Syrian shop. And she knew that because she is from the area, so she knew who owns those shops. But then she was totally unable to tell me if the people we would cross in the street were Syrian refugees or not. She just had no idea how to identify them. Thank you for...
Thank you, Marianne. Very interesting presentation. So, are you considering these as the three mechanisms for why refugees have been easily absorbed? Is it controlling refugees, social learning, and recovering normality? Are you considering them as good mechanisms for absorption? Did I hear you well?
It's not a moral statement. It's not good or not good. It's mechanism I identified, and it's those that are linked to public spaces in the sense that obviously there's a lot of other factors that allows this absorptions. And I wanted to focus today especially on public spaces because we had this urban focus. But obviously you have to consider factors that are linked to the identity of the refugee who moved to Borjamud, the fact that they were mostly Armenian, Syrian, or other factors that obviously you have to take into account.
It's just because I like the two others, just it's not an issue of liking, but comparing it to a mapping we did for 24 municipalities, the controlling refugees, the so-called controlling means the few and other mechanisms that were put in place were main triggers of conflict. And was increasing tension and the sense of discrimination against. So it's interesting that you found it as a mechanism that helped absorption.
Maybe I can...
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and let's open the floor for questions. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Maybe after the...
Okay. Questions, reactions, remarks, feedback to the three speakers. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the questions. Yes.
Thank you for these very interesting presentations. I have two questions. First to Ms. Madori. What do you think? Is there anything what we, for example, in Germany can learn from this integration process of the Syrian refugees here in Lebanon? You know, we have only a few 100,000 Syrians in Germany, and we have a lot of problems already, and as I see here, you have much more refugees from Syria in this country, but with less problems, as I have to imagine. And my second question is to Ms. Berkby. It's around about the same question. With, I think, around about 800,000 refugees in Germany at the moment, we have enormous housing problems. The refugees have to live in gymnasiums, in tents, and so on. How was or is it possible that here in Lebanon, 60% of the refugees can live in apartments and in houses? Of course, also if there are problems with overcrowding and so on. But why we in Germany are not able to find solutions like the people here in Lebanon did?
Interesting question. Shall we keep going? Other questions, remarks, or shall I? Yes.
Hi. My question is also for Ms. Madori. You mentioned you had more cases other than Burj Hammoud, right? I wanted to know, because you mentioned also that there are other causes for the cohesion or incohesion between the host population and the refugees. I wanted to know if you figured any differences between the cases you looked at in this cohesion based on, let's say, the community or the background of the community that is in these cities and let's say the cultural background or the religious background of the refugees. So if you looked at that and if you had any interesting findings on that level. Thank you.
Interesting questions. I had the same in mind. Other questions, remarks? Okay, let's go for the first round. So what Germany can learn from the Lebanese experience?
Thank you for your question. It's actually, when I started this research, obviously I had a strong bias in the sense that I'm French, and I came from a country where the borders were closed. So I was, from the very beginning, interested in understanding how Lebanon was dealing with that. I don't know, I have no idea. I would just emphasize maybe the points that Aline actually made when she formulated recommendations for NGOs or agencies here, and that one of them I really like is to rely on local actors, and I, over the course of my research, I realized that municipalities were the one that knew the area the most, but at the same time they totally powerless because there's no capacities, there's no human, financial, infrastructural capacities for them to take any sort of action. So I'm not going to give you any sort of recommendation for Germany. This is not going to happen. But I believe relying on local actors that have been working on the field for a long time and knows the realities the most can be a starting point.
Can I answer myself this question? Because I haven't answered it. I think you need to learn a little bit of chaos. I'm serious in a way. I think so. It's chaos in economy means allowing informal interactions within the marketplace. I think Germany is too strong. It makes us anti-fragile, and I seriously think that, as well as in terms of shelter, a few studies were made. Like if we would have organized it better and made formal camps, probably it would have. It would have been a higher risk. I would like to hear what do you think as well, seen about this. So some studies are showing the informal settlements were a good, because it allowed informal dynamics within community that created informal social safety nets that created higher informal security sense between communities. So in terms of urban, economic, and in terms of social dynamics. So we can teach you how to be more chaotic in the coming phase if you want. We're working on this. Sine, do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I come from Norway, and we agreed to take in 8,000 Syrian refugees over 3 years, so go figure. And that's not going that well because we don't have housing, even though we have numerous villages across the country, which is basically now not inhabited. So, but that goes, of course, back to the question. Chaos is a good, embrace the chaos could be a good motto. But I mean, of course, that goes back to the question that you need to really assess the asylum question before you actually give people the opportunity to work. In Lebanon, even though refugees now are not allowed to work, 80% of the Syrian refugees pay rent, even for the plots of land where you pitch up your tent, you pay rent. Which means that per month there is 33 million going into the economy from rent from refugees. So of course then, yes, it is a massive burden on the country. But if you then also take into account is it 2 billion that the humanitarian community has put into the response over the last 4 years, plus the monthly rent, there is actually something going into the economy as well. It's not only a burden, and this, I mean, I read these updates on a daily basis from Norway, and it's just an unlogical discussion because in Norway we are 100% dependent on foreign work forces to come in and do a lot of the work that we craving for and services that we want. So in Lebanon, it's maybe more accepted that there is already a trade-off in some of the sectors to have a presence of the Syrian refugees. However, of course, there is a discussion on the jobs that are taken away from Lebanese. Some of that is, of course, we have assessment that show that that's partially true, but then, of course, also 50% of the refugees are children. They're not in the same manner stealing jobs from anyone, but it puts the pressure on systems, of course.
Any reaction?
Yeah, I will be very brief. 2 things. We're not doing them in Lebanon, but we might. Empower and educate local actors, because action starts with local actors, and do not create artificial and parallel systems.
I don't think Germany needs it to create would you like as well to comment on the question community, cultural background of refugees versus host community?
Yes, so I did most of the fieldwork in the. It was you, right? Yeah, because I'm looking at you. I did most of the fieldwork in Borhamud, but I also did some comparison with Sin el-Fil, which is a neighborhood municipality, and the situation was actually very different in the sort that, in the sense that there's curfew was very strictly implemented. The area is very harshly policed. Every few blocks you have a policeman who's, I mean, they're taking shift, obviously, but they've been given instructions to look for Syrian refugees, to spot them, to arrest them. So there was a strong differences with Borhamud, where the curfew, the implementation of the curfew follow a much more flexible pattern. And this, I think, can, it's a way to answer your question about how the curfew can not be a source of tension. I believe that in Borhamud, it was not a source of tension because it had this flexibility, so everyone could see in its positive aspect somehow. So the Lebanese residents who were asking for it were happy to see it announced, and refugees who were living under it could still manage somehow. So I believe this loose implementation was a positive thing. And about the background, one of the factors I was just mentioning before about the social peace in Borhamud, I think it's because Borhamud has this very strong Armenian community, and data is just hard to give numbers, but I would say that at least 50-60% of the refugees who came to Borhamud are Armenian Syrian. And that allowed the Armenian community in Borhamud to have a sort of rebirth and I mean, the word is loaded, but like to be able to revive the community, and so they saw it as a positive thing. So can be one of it.
So that's another suggestion. Loose implementation of laws and decrees could be another solution for Germany. Yes.
Working on this issue, I'm a landscape architect working with professor at the landscape department. And I'm really interested on how we can fill the gap between the local and the help, and the way in which normal people every day are dealing with this crisis, how they are working with, they are helping these people in informal, if we want to use this term, integration. And how, at the upper level, all the planning, all the research, all the mapping are working. At the same time, I feel that there is this gap, and all the map, all the strategy, when they will be implemented, because right now I haven't seen anything really implemented. Then there are a lot of research, a lot of study, a lot of report, but nothing on the field. And I have the impression that at the end, when something will be done, will be already too late, and also all this data will be obsolete, because they will not represent anymore the reality. You know better than me how the everyday life construct and change and transform everything in a rhythm that we cannot really work with and control. Yes, then how, and if you already thought about how we can really be more helpful, more on the side and doing things really to help this and to not only the Syrian, because I'm really worried about the future of this country, and because new city will come later on. I believe that in the future, in the Bekaa, there will become, they will build really huge city, because all of these people, they will not go for the future next maybe 10 years. Then all this tent, maybe they will be constructed structure. Already there are help in trying to build something to help these people. then new city, new big metropolitan area will be built. Which will be the future of this country that it's already almost built?
Sorry, your first name?
Maria Gabriella Trovato.
Maria. Thank you, Maria. Other questions, remarks? So how can we, yes?
The geographic location for your study, so you're saying you worked on Burj Hamoud. Was Naba included with it, or because Naba is kind of a between Burj Hamoud municipality and Sinarfir municipality? So that's my question. And
The area Naba, which
Yes.
is one of the, yeah.
was part of this.
So was it included in your study?
It's officially included. Yeah, it's part of Burj Hamoud municipality, but it's interesting you say that because there's this boundaries in people's minds that it's different because the population is different, the religious background of the inhabitants is different. But yeah, it's part of the jurisdiction, the official jurisdiction.
I
Just to-
just had
go
a
ahead.
small comment about the housing and the question with the German crisis. I guess because like the issue, okay, so like, I don't know the percentage of refugees who are currently in houses, but we really need to consider the housing conditions and even the house infrastructure. I think even in like the minimal requirements or the minimal standards of what the house should be is not even met. So I guess that also.
Yeah, it's a good remark. So even when we're saying renting, so the housing standards are extremely low, even though it's supposed to be rent. So how, Maria, how can we be helpful? Other questions, remarks? So how can, you mean academics, how academics could be helpful, or anyone?
But sometimes they cannot be really helpful. There are a lot of constraints, and how we can fill this gap?
That's a big question. Just a quick reaction. First, I think a lot is being done, and I think that, and that's a personal opinion. I think there is an opportunity. Probably also there's another lesson for the Germans is that I think the stalemate in the political system now is an opportunity for Lebanon. I can explain how. I think because the political system is unfunctioning and politicians cannot meet and agree, they're leaving the job to technical people within the public institutions. And that's my opinion. I know I'm on record, so I'm not going to say much, but I think some very good and technical people are on behalf of government working with some very good and technical people with partners and union agencies. There are a lot of flaws, a lot of problems, a lot of decisions to be made. Yes, that's true. At the same time, I think it's leaving room for interesting, technical, difficult conversations and some serious policies that have serious implications. I see in this an opportunity. So probably one other lesson is that make sure that your political system doesn't function. So maybe it will be helpful. I don't know if you agree, because probably you're in relation as well with government. So I wouldn't say, no, nothing is being done. I think a lot is being done. I think there is a lot to be learned from what's happening now. At the same time, I think, yes, there are gaps in information. So there is gap in information. Though we have studies, but I can tell you, for example, in terms of livelihood, no, there is gap. We don't have serious macro studies and micro studies that is specific to different markets. I don't think there is anything related to social cohesion that has been done significantly on what type of mechanisms we can put in place and the action mechanisms, how they're affecting. I think in terms of urban, seriously, I think it's one of the least tapped areas, and correct me if I'm wrong, seen on this. I think it's especially we're talking about some urban spaces that are very rural, where we double population, but no one's looking at the urban construct and how it affects cohesion / vulnerabilities. I think we're very far from this. That's my opinion. I haven't seen something that is meaningful. So I don't know what you think, because you correlate with government as well.
I mean, you raised a couple of interesting points. I mean, so yes, of course, we all understand that the refugees will not live in a year or 2 or 3 or any foreseeable future right now. But even though many want to go home, they are likely to, high percentage are likely to stay. 80% of refugees normally stay post-conflict. Again, the population in informal tent settlements is only 18%. And they are located there usually because they had some connections pre-crisis that was working in the agricultural sector in Lebanon, and then they are joined by family and relatives. So it increases, of course, the pressure in the agricultural sector because they actually occupy land that was used for production. And to some extent, I agree that there's a likelihood that some of those settlements will stay. However, we are not allowed to do anything permanent. There are some NGOs that has implemented some semi-permanent features, but all in all, that's a very small percentage. So everything that we do in informal tent settlements has to be temporary. And again, there is no livelihood opportunities in these areas. So also from the rural areas, there is a movement towards the cities now because of the work opportunities in the informal sector. But then, as you say, the urban dimensions of the crisis is not understood. It's not understood in terms of shelter, and that's an interesting thing because even though we know that everybody or the far majority pay rent, we are not engaging in a meaningful discussion on how our investments in the humanitarian response can actually contribute to the production of affordable housing. That's a no-go. So we are not like that's sector questions that the government want to keep out of the shelter discussions. So already there, that's quite tricky because there is no proper discussions on affordable housing in the country. And then the investments we have in, for instance, infrastructure through our WASH programs, those have to follow the already defined plans of the water establishments and the Ministry of Energy and Water. But those plans, they don't take into account informal areas, Palestine, refugee camps, Palestinian gatherings, poor neighborhoods, basically all the areas where you would have a concentration of refugees in poor urban areas. So for us, we do try to, for instance, the UN system is there to help the government, not to take over anything. So we try to support the government, but that's of course a challenging discussion. And as for the role of NGOs and local stakeholders, there has been a very interesting sequence of the protests this fall linked to the solid waste crisis. But of course, I think we discussed this yesterday in another conference. What happens during the elections of municipal elections? Will people then also pick up the same discussion in the municipal elections? Not only put pressure on the Ministry of Environment, it's not the Ministry of Environment that put plans on the table. The plans for solid waste management, for wastewater management, for water management, they all go back to the National Physical Master Plan of, is it 97 or something? And that has a population estimation until 2030 of 5 million. We're way past 5 million, so we are working according to some plans that's outdated. So the pressure needs to also be on what kind of elections that needs to happen and what kind of structure you need on the local level to respond, and then for the NGOs to feed into that system, not only on the national level and on ministries.
I would like to close with one question for everyone. You have a question before me? Okay, go ahead.
Hello. The remark or the question that I have, do you have data about the refugees if they come from rural or urban places? Do you take this in consideration? Yes or no?
Yes, there is data.
Yes? Okay,
Yeah.
so do you think, my question is, the refugees that are based in the Bekaa region, in tents, are they all coming from rural? No, that there is no like. Okay,
correlation, no.
Okay, because what I was thinking about, the integration would be easier in urban places like Bush Hammoud for refugees who come from urban places. And what I was thinking for the cases like European countries, already the refugees, they will face cultural shock because they are leaving. It's Lebanon and Syria, it's closer in culture. those countries, like European countries, are already different culture and different everything. So you add this matter to the matter that the refugee might be coming from a rural place. So this will complicate more and more the situation, because he has to deal also with other issues. And plus, I can imagine that the refugees who are leaving completely the area, they are more desperate, and they don't think about coming back to their country. Because refugees who are coming to Beirut or to Lebanon in general, they will one day, they think that one day maybe they will come back to Syria. But the people who are facing death and they know that they might die on the way going to Europe, they have like completely forgot, and they want to forget about their country and go start up in the other countries. So do you take this in consideration? Thank you.
So probably this is another recommendation, that Germany adopt some Arab cultural traditions and norms, and maybe yeah. Now we're building some lessons for you. A last question to close with this for everyone in the room, and that's, I have a particular interest in this, your help as well. Do you think Lebanon should adopt social cohesion as a process, means have a strategy for social cohesion, or should it be mainstreamed as a result while dealing with the triggers? Means, shall we say, oh, the Lebanese government and stakeholders should work on how we're going to make sure to diffuse social tensions, or shall we say, oh no, it's a process thing, so let's work on livelihood, shelter, food security, and the result would be social stability. Keeping in mind that the Lebanese government want to make sure that the Syrians would return as soon as they can. That's one. There is fear of coexistence, of demography, and there is fear of security. Taking these into consideration, so no integration. What would you suggest? Should it be mainstreamed or be one strategy by itself? So, and that question not only for you, for everyone in the room. Who would like to give it a try? Yes, go ahead, Zine.
Yeah. It's funny you say strategy for non-integration, because the refugees are already living in the community, so you can't disintegrate them all now. I mean, they are already to some extent integrated, but of course they go to the representatives from their own communities, as you would in quite many other cities as well. On the social cohesion, I mean, I think we have tested out now how does it work for us to really follow this sector response, where also social cohesion or social stability is one of the sectors in the response. And it doesn't really work, because we are not able to come up with meaningful plans which are intersectoral and area-based. I'm not saying necessarily that area-based response plans is the only way to respond to an urban crisis, but it's certainly one of the tools that has been assessed to be a meaningful tool to respond. So rather a social cohesion and resilience framework that's integrated into the response plans at all levels.
Rather than have a social cohesion strategy for the...
Exactly, because if you look at the sources of tension, it's often linked to infrastructure, it's linked to other dynamics than just the interaction between communities.
One of the critiques of the humanitarian system, especially when addressing an urban crisis, is the sector-based approach that Sene was talking about, and having social cohesion as one sector and one area might add to the difficulty of addressing the needs of the urban refugees. So again, trying to integrate but not mainstream, as sometimes when we mainstream we forget about things, so not treating it separately but trying to integrate between different, yes, and working through systems approach, because it's largely urban, and you cannot look at education without looking at cohesion. You cannot look at livelihoods without looking at social cohesion and stability. So, yeah.
I second that 100%. There's no I believe social cohesion is a result of different dynamics at play, and there's no such verb as coherate people. Like, you don't make people live together. You put the conditions so that they will be together.
And one thing to add, invest in understanding more social cohesion. Much of the initiatives that we looked at in the literature review really had, sorry to say, bad designs in terms of methodology, in terms of sampling. Possibly it was the best that organizations could do, but we need to understand more to know how to address the drivers of the tensions.
Any answer for that? Okay, give me a second to stop. Thank you very much for the three panelists for your attention and contributions. So we'll go to lunch outside.
I was talking to Dr. Ralph, and I was mentioning this late lunch makes it very difficult for such an important session. And specifically, what Professor Robel will introduce about how to make things work and how actually to bring many of the issues we discussed in the morning and perhaps make them practically working. Just to introduce myself, my name is Nasser Yassin. I'm the Director of Research here in the Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs. I'll be introducing Professor Robel in a minute, and perhaps I'll just do a very quick concluding remarks from the sessions of today and some of the lessons we got from today. I notice there's a lot of echo, but perhaps Amir will fix it. Okay, so let me introduce my colleague, Professor Ralph Robel. Initially received industrial training at Deutsche Bank and then received a doctorate in economics from the Christian Albrecht University in Kiel through the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. He taught economic policy at Part2 University in Estonia and the University of Erfurt. Currently, he's a professor of economics, specialized in economic policy at West Saxon University of Applied Sciences at Zwaku. There's a lot of difficult names in the... He's specialized in the theory of economic systems, social market economy, as well as economic development of emerging markets and LDC. What Dr. Ralph will do is kind of really bring the essence of what was presented during the day and perhaps give us some lessons, some advice, some ideas of how to make it work. Please. About 25 minutes.
Marhaba and good afternoon. Thank you for your attention. I'm very happy that so many people are here again to hear also my presentation. I know it's quite hard for you. It's the last presentation, and it's also the presentation after the lunch break, so I think everyone is satisfied and a little bit tired, but maybe I can wake you up a little bit with my speech here today. Secondly, I have to mention, my work today is quite hard because I'm here as a bad cop. Now from American criminal movies, this game, good cop, bad cop. Dr. Schäfer was a good cop. He introduced the idea of the social market economy, and I'm now the bad cop who has to explain to you why maybe it's not so easy to implement such an economic system in the Lebanon. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, briefly, again, what is social market economy, what are its benefits? And then, first of all, I will talk about the implementation problems. I will introduce a few theoretical approaches of the last decades. Then, first of all, I will discuss the so-called doorstep conditions for the introduction of any functioning market economy Western style. And last but not least, I also will discuss the importance of cultural contradictions and resistance for the implementation of a social market economy. Let's start with social market economy. I think everyone knows football. And what has football in common with social market economy? A lot. In a good football game, we have rules which are set in advance. And we have a referee who is blowing in the case of fouls, for example. And that's exactly the basic idea of a social market economy. In a social market economy, we have rules for all the participants of the economic systems, the employers, the employees, the producers, the consumers, and so on. We have, for example, a competition law. We have rules about other important topics in the economic system, in contrast to a free market economy where are more or less no rules. Of course, also in the United States or in the UK, where we talk about a free market economy, there are a lot of rules, but much less rules than in a social market economy, like in Germany, for example. So when we talk about social market economy, think about a good game of football, with rules set in advance, with a referee, the state, blowing his pipe when someone is fouling. That's a basic idea. So what are the benefits and what are the advantages, the main advantages of such a system? From my point of view, a social market economy is some kind of a free market economy, not combined with any part of socialism, but with regulative measures. Regulative measures which prevent market failures like monopolization and externalities. And so far, I think the main advantages of the social market economy are that the main goal is welfare for everyone, not only for a small group in the society, but for a large group of persons in the society. And as a result, we will get less social differences in our society by the introduction of such an economic system. Additionally, it's a permanently open system with market access and competition, and we have a legal framework for entrepreneurs. So far, so fine. But of course, there are also disadvantages. It's quite a sophisticated economic system with a strong but subsidiary state. I will come back to this topic again and again during my speech because it's so important. We need a functioning state which is strong on the one hand, but on the other hand is subsidiary. It's not interfering into market processes, but it's setting only the framework for the economic activity of the actors. So as a result, it's quite difficult to implement because it's depending on the rule of law, first of all. So, ladies and gentlemen, so let's start with a few approaches about how to implement a Western-style model in other countries. Here I brought with me 3 books. Maybe you know the right one, Why Nations Fail, by Acemoglu Robinson. It's from 2012, quite famous book. Then the other one in the middle, Violence and Social Order by North Wallis-Weingast, which I prefer. And there is a third one, the title is in German only, Grundsätze der Wirtschaftspolitik, Basic of Economic Policy by Walter Eucken. Walter Eucken was already mentioned today by Dr. Schäfer because he is one of the founding fathers of the social market economy. And what is really interesting for me is that all 3 authors wrote about the same topics and they had the same ideas. But of course, North Wallis-Weingast and also Acemoglu Robinson don't quote Walter Eucken because they did not speak or did not understand German, and Walter Eucken wrote his book in German language. So what Walter Eucken is talking about is a basic idea of the social market economy consisting of 3 pillars. We already heard about the central pillar, the market economic order, with the basic principles of a social market economy. But these pillars must be accompanied by 2 additional pillars. As you can see here, the rule of law, which again means a strong but a subsidiary state, and on the other hand, of course, democracy. So far, Walter Eucken. So you have to understand that social market economy is not only an economic system, but it's a social system, combining all parts of the society and bringing together different ideas of rule of law, democracy, market order, and so on, to implement an economic and political order for society which brings welfare to everyone as a main goal. We call that also the interdependency of orders. Now, the modern literature, North Wallis Weingast, they distinguish open access orders and limited access orders. And it's quite interesting how they define open access orders, for example. They say, okay, they are political and economic developing, so this is a Western style of economic orders. They have a more decentralized government, rich civil society, lots of organizations, and widespread impersonal social relations. This is very important. Impersonal social relationship. That means functioning rule of law, secure property rights, fairness, equality, and so on. And they distinguish between open access orders and limited access orders. And the limited access orders are not the Western world, but the rest of the world. And all these societies are, in relation, slow growing and vulnerable to shocks in their opinion. Important is that limited access orders are characterized by politics without consent of the governed. There are relatively small numbers of economic and political organizations, and we have a predominance of social relationship organized along personal lines, in contrast to the rule of law and the impersonal social relationship in Western-style economic systems. As a result, in the limited access orders, there are privileges and social hierarchies. The third book, Achimolo Robinson from 2012, they distinguish inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. First of all, I have to say that institutions means rules, norms, not organizations. Yeah? Institutional economists use the word institutions for rules and not for organizations. And like North Wallis Weingast, they distinguish between the Western world and the rest of the world. So they say inclusive institutions, that means we have secure property rights, law and order, public services and regulations, relatively free entry of new business, access to education, opportunity for the great majority of citizens, and so on. And that sounds intensive for citizens tapping the full potential of all talents in a country. That's right, and that's also especially right for a social market economy. Also for a free market economy, like in the United States or in the UK, but especially also for a social market economy like we call our system in Germany. In contrast to these inclusive institutions, in the rest of the world, mostly we find extractive institutions. And these institutions are designed by the politically powerful elites to extract resources from the rest of the society. And ladies and gentlemen, of course, it's a first question I have to ask you. What do you think? Is Lebanon suffering from such a kind of extractive institutions? Yes or no? And to which extent? In the following chapter, I will refer to North Wallis Weingast because, from my point of view, they set out very interestingly the doorstep conditions for introducing a Western-style model of market economy at all. They say we need peace, first of all, we need rule of law, and something like democracy and civil society. So let me compare Germany and Lebanon to find out what are the differences between our countries, and is there any chance for the Lebanon to introduce a social market economy or another Western-style model of market economy in the next years? North Wallis Weingast define peace as consolidated political control of the military. That means all military forces must be under control of the state. So if we observe the Global Peace Index, we can see rank number 1 holds Iceland. Germany is on rank 16. Lebanon worldwide on the rank 145. Why? Okay, quite simple. You know that better than me. We have the Syrian war directly abroad. We have Palestinian camps in your country where you don't have the control about the military. We have the Hezbollah and so on. So here exists no peace in the basic sense of the word. this country is suffering from a kind of civil war somehow. But interestingly, when we compare the regional rank of both countries, we can see Germany, as I said, holds rank 16. Lebanon, oops, sorry, not working without a mouse, so nice. Lebanon 145, but watch these regional ranks here. And you can see Germany holds rank 15 within Europe, but Lebanon rank 13 within Middle East and Northern Africa. And so far we can say that the situation of the Lebanon is not so bad as we could imagine within a first view on these statistical data. That means Lebanon is maybe much more peaceful than other countries in the region, and as a result, we can have hope that Lebanon may be much more able to introduce the doorstep conditions than other countries in this region. Why peace is so important? Yeah, the Institute for Economics and Peace accounted for the costs of war as percentage of GDP. You can see here in Syria, the costs of the conflict are accounted for 42% of the GDP of the country, and in the Lebanon for 8%. So also here we can see the large difference between a country where we really have civil war and a country like the Lebanon. Also, that gives us some hope that the Lebanon has more possibilities to introduce a Western-style model of market economy. Interestingly, also urban population is in strong relation with the peacefulness of a country. And as you can see here, there's a projection for the years 2015 to 2050 of the Institute for Economics and Peace about the development of the urban population by level of peacefulness. And you can see here where the peacefulness is on a very low level in red. There we have a huge rise of urban population. That means without peace, we have to expect a rise of the urban population, and we also have to expect a rise of the poor urban population in Lebanon. So far, this topic, peace and peacefulness, is, I think, of highest importance for your country. Second doorstep condition, rule of law, especially for the elites. That means the establishment of a functioning juridical system and also successful anti-corruption measures. Here we get a little bit other picture. As you can see here in the figure, we have a positive correlation between the perceived quality of rule of law and the GDP per capita. I'm sorry, this is in German, but I think you understand. Sorry. I'll show it with a... I don't use it. I only talk about it. That's more simple. Okay. You can see here in red countries belonging to the European Union or countries which want to join the European Union. And in blue, other countries. You can see here right above, for example, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. And in all these countries, we have a strong positive correlation between the perceived quality of the rule of law and, on the other hand, the GDP per capita. And in the left below, with blue points, we see Belarus, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, where we have also a strong, but let's say negative correlation, a low minimum or a low level of the quality of rule of law, and also a low level of GDP. So that means as higher the level of rule of law is, the higher is also the possibility to attain higher growth rates and a higher level of GDP. So rule of law means, rule of law, no, was a wrong one. Sorry. Here we have the corruption perception index as a second interesting point to observe this rule of law question, and I will already skip to the next slide. Here you can see Germany Germany holds rank 79, or a score of 79 of 100 points. This is rank number 12 worldwide. So we have a quite high level of rule of law, a quite low level of corruption. Yeah? And also within Europe, our situation is quite comfortable because the average within Western Europe and the EU is about 68, and Germany holds a score points of 79. So the situation in Germany is really good. Compared to the Lebanon, Lebanon has a score of only 27. That means the country is highly corrupt. And the global rank is 136. Additionally, the average score in the Middle East and Northern African region is 38, but Lebanon holds only rank 27. That means the situation is much worse than in the rest of the surrounding countries. Yeah, of course, there are also exemptions. That means we have to know that corruption is one of the most important problems for Lebanon nowadays on its way to a social market economy or to any other kind of Western-style market economy. How about democracy and civil society? Yeah, North Wallis-Weingast define this as continuously lived forms of public and private organizations. That means civil society with lots of organizations, promotion of organization building, especially of parties, unions, and so on. Let's have a brief view on the democracy ranking of the quality of democracy in 2013. And you can see that, of course, also here the Western world is on the top. We have the best ranks. Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Nordic countries are the most democratic countries in the world. And then Western Europe, Central Europe is also quite democratic, and the rest of the world is not so democratic. Here I have the democracy ranking scores for 2014. And again, you can see here rank number 1, Norway, then Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, New Zealand. Germany holds rank number 8, Lebanon rank 88. So this is again far away from the Western level. But if we compare this with the neighboring states, for example, with Syria, with Egypt, with Libya, and so on, then we can see that the situation in Lebanon is not so bad as it seems to be. In this country, we have another culture, we have another history, we have other circumstances in all kinds of the economic and political development, and so far this rank is not so bad as it seems on a first view. But ladies and gentlemen, what we have to learn, first of all, before you can start to implement something like a social market economy or any other kind of a Western-style market economy, you have to think about how to fulfill these doorstep conditions. Peace, rule of law, less corruption, and more democracy and more civil society. But maybe Lebanon is already on the right path into this direction, and you only have to move forward to improve the situation, and then within the next years or decades it will be possible to fulfill these doorstep conditions. But of course, there are also implementation problems during this process of the implementation of a social market economy. There are, for example, cultural contradictions and also resistance we have to take into account. Cultural contradictions are observed by economists since around about 20-25 years. Already North in 1919 wrote a famous book about the informal versus formal institutions. And basically we can say formal institutions are laws which are set by the state, and informal institutions are something like the culture behind that. And there may be contradictions between formal institutions and informal institutions. Here you can see, for example, the results of the transition in Europe and Central Asia. This is statistics of the EBRD from 1997, quite old, but really interesting to observe, because in that year, the EBRD built up clusters, regional clusters, From the left to the right, it's Central and Eastern Europe, and the Baltics, Southeastern Europe, Central CIS, Caucasus, and Central Asia. And then they measured the transition score points of these countries for the year 1996 and built up clusters, and you can see the correlation is negative. That means countries which are quite close to Western Europe and share something of Western culture got better score points or more score points, were more successful in transition to a Western style model than countries which are a little bit more far away from a cultural point of view or also from a regional geographical point of view. That means Lebanon is quite far away from Europe, but of course it's a question you have to answer: how Western, how European is your country? Yeah? I don't know that. I cannot tell you you are Westerners or you are an Arabic society, or I know you're not a Muslim society, or half of your population are Christians, so maybe this is an advantage for you compared to Syria or compared to Jordan or Egypt and other countries. Yeah? But the thing you have to discuss alone. Which impacts informal institutions may have, you can see here on this slide. Maybe positive impacts from old traditions of trade and commerce, which are for sure here in Lebanon, entrepreneurial activities in history, experience with the civil society, and so on. On the negative side, sometimes we find in several countries communist traditions, for example, in China, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and so on, or informal networks. In China, it's called guanxi. It's very important for the Chinese economy and it's a huge problem for the Chinese economy. Yeah? And also in Lebanon, maybe you have some kind of informal networks which were important for your development and which also hinder your further development. We already talked about corruption as a huge problem, and sometimes we find also subsistence economy as negative impacts of formal institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, of course, there will exist also resistance. Resistance, first of all, by the ruling elite. We can understand that from the book written by Acemoglu and Robinson because of the extractive institutions. Extractive institutions are very important and very nice for the ruling elite. They are afraid of losing their privileges, of course. And then they want to protect the attractive institutions as a result. And that is, of course, one main reason why it's not so easy to implement a Western-style model or inclusive institutions in a country which is characterized by the extractive institutions. The second group, which must be mentioned, are the corrupt bureaucrats and others, who may be afraid of losing their additional income. And last but not least, we will also find additional potential losers of such a transformation process of a society and an economy. People who are afraid of institutional changes at all, people who have adaptation problems, for example, elderly people, more conservative people, people from the countryside, and so on. Last but not least, and this is already my conclusion, I think we have to say that social market economy is a very nice system. It's a rule-based, a privilege-free order. It's a model for development, not only for European countries, also for emerging markets, for less developed countries, and so on. So maybe it's also an interesting model for the Lebanon. But of course, there are the implementation problems, the preconditions like peace, rule of law, and democracy, which must be fulfilled. There are for sure more or less cultural contradictions. There will exist some resistance by the ruling elite for sure. But last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I think the solution to establish such a Western style or another functioning model of a Market economy, like a social market economy, need a long-term learning and adaptation process. You should start as soon as possible. And I see this conference as a very good possibility to discuss the advantages and also the disadvantages of our German model, the social market economy, to help you, not in the sense that you should adapt the social market economy as soon as possible in your country, and you should not call it a social market economy or as you like, but you should start thinking about this model, especially in contrast to the existing model you have here in the Lebanon at the moment, also in contrast to the free market economies, maybe you know from the United States and other countries. And hopefully you will have got a few new ideas, and these ideas will support your further development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
So that was a little bit more than 25 minutes.
You're fantastically German in this. You were on time. Thank you very much, Dr. Ralph. I think this was very interesting. Before I give the floor the opportunity to ask you, and I think there should be some interesting questions coming from the floor, I want just to give a few remarks and a few comments. I want also to comment on the conference as a whole and the issue of urban. So I have 3 points. But I'll start with the first about informal institutions. And I personally have interest in this. And the Institute, where we're doing some work on informal institutions, particularly how socially excluded communities and populations rely on informal institutions and build, as a matter of fact, informal institutions to cope. In a vacuum, when it comes to the role of the state and the vacuum that, or the absence, the gap that the state has created by not providing a lot of services, it's only the way for communities, as a matter of fact, to build informal institutions in order to cope. This becomes the only way to get their livelihoods and access, their livelihood. So if it has to do with, hooking the electricity, it becomes an act of resistance itself, because it's the only way they can get access to electricity, or dig well that's illegally digged by those communities. I'm not celebrating this, but I'm saying there's not only one way of going, which is the very formal. I think in many instances we have to accommodate, if not, take in the informal institutions and try to work around them. So this is my first comment, and this is very relevant to the context of Lebanon, but a lot in the region, I think. Now, in a region that's rocked with conflicts, a lot of uncertainty around, the role of the state. The state in itself as a construct is being actually revisited altogether, whether in formally strong states like in Syria or Egypt or otherwhere. So we need to really qualify this concept of formal institutions in our context, and not so much, say that the way forward is only the formal institutions. I think we need to look at informal institutions. My second point about urban, whether it's related to urban poverty, urban divisions, or peace in the cities or in urban settings, I think cities grow organically in this part of the world and everywhere. And with this growth, it brings a lot of complexities. And cities become sometimes, magnifiers of tensions, of poverty, of inequalities. But also cities become places for opportunities for the urban poor to access livelihoods, to, try to get a job, whether in the informal economy or in the quasi-formal economy. So also, again, this is related to formality, but also we see cities, as a matter of fact, contributing into tension, but also sometimes they may contribute into peace, and they may contribute into better economy, and they may contribute to better livelihoods. So that's my second point about urban poverty and urban issues, and I think many of my colleagues today presented aspects related to urban issues, urban poverty, urban tension, and tension in the city, and I think the lesson here to look at the city as this magnifier. I really like to look at the city as a magnifier, where through the magnifier we can either magnify tensions, or actually we can magnify solutions and magnify peace and magnify better economies. And my third point is more methodological, and I want to commend the use of certain tools that were presented today in urban studies. I think the use of maps and the use of certain visuals in understanding dynamics in the city is really very interesting and should be the way forward to inform policymakers. Use such tools and try to understand the reality, but also bring it forward to the policymakers, to stakeholders, decision makers, because I think it makes an analysis of the complexities in cities, as I mentioned earlier, much easier. So with this comment, I thank you again for the presentation, and perhaps some of the points I raised, you might want to address them, but I also open the floor for questions, comments, remarks, and so on. Thank you. Anyone at 3:45 to comment? Yes, we have yeah, please.
Thank you for the presentation. During the presentation, I often thought about the question, what was there first, the chicken or the egg? And what I mean with this is also a bit what the comment you just made when we speak about the influence of culture, for example. I think we could also say that our environment is forming our culture and is a product of our culture. And you gave the example, for example, of Hezbollah. We could say Hezbollah is a threat to the rule of law, or is a threat to the monopoly over force by the state. But I think we could also say it is one of these informal reactions by a population to a lack of for example, protection the state can give, or something like that. So I'm not questioning, for example, the correlations you showed, which were very interesting, but often I wonder what comes first and what is influencing. Could the rule of law also be a result of other stable preconditions, for example? So it's maybe more a thought than a question. Thank you.
I think when we observe the history of Europe and the Western world, we can see that the establishment of some kind of rule of law was a chicken, and the higher growth rates were the egg. And so far, I think there is a necessity to improve these structures of rule of law and democracy and so on. But I see, of course, that in your country you have, let's say, other problems, and you are substituting this functioning state by informal institutions, which works quite well, but of course on a quite low level compared to the level we have reached in Western Europe or in the US and so on. And so far it is a very, very good question whether you should try to copy the Western models somehow, or maybe you have to find your own way somehow. Yeah? And the economists are struggling about this question. Yeah? You can read, for example, Issam Robinson, and they say quite simply, okay, all the societies must go through 3 centuries of Western-style development, and then they become as rich as the Western economies are. Others say, okay, it's no problem to introduce Western-style models within 1 year. I think, for example, about Jeffrey Sachs, maybe you know him, very famous American economist, and in 1990, he said, okay, in Poland we can establish a market economy within 1 year. It took 15 to 20 years in Poland, which is a European country. And so far, I'm not so sure. When I talk about social market economy, I try to explain it as an idea, a basic idea, and not as an existing economic system. For sure, your country cannot copy the existing German economic system. It would be, on the one hand, too simple, and on the other hand, it's not impossible. The only thing I want you to do is to think about our ideas and the models, and then to improve the situation in your country in that way you want to do. And I think this is the only thing we can do. We are coming from a rich country, from a country far away. It's the first time for me to stay here in Lebanon, for example. So I have to say I know nothing about your country, but I learned a lot during 1.5 days already. So thank you very much to all the participants here of the conference. It was very, very interesting for me, and especially your remarks about this importance of the informal institutions gave me a better understanding of the functioning of your society here. Yeah? What we call the Arabic or the Lebanese chaos. Yeah? Somehow it works. Yeah? But I think the most important is here not the question, where is the chicken, where is the egg, who was the first one. Yeah? The most important thing is the dialogue about the different systems, yeah? Getting a deeper understanding of the other models, and by this way, more thinking about further development, and maybe 1 or 2 small ideas of the social market economy may be interesting also for Lebanon in the future, and then we are already successful here.
Please. May I ask you to introduce yourself? Sorry, I missed our colleague, but you'll do it later.
Okay, I'm Sarah, and I'm from Egypt. My comment is based on your comment that in Egypt, the informal sector has become so radicalized that it's too hard to talk about shifting it from informal to formal sector. If anything, what's happening right now with the civil society organizations is actually celebrating the informal sector, because it actually proved to have lifted off some of the economic burden from the formal economy. And now the formal institutions are working on a rather smaller scale, excluding the informal sector. So now they have less of a burden to work on, to focus on, now that the informal sector has become so self-sustained and self-consolidated. And I come from an NGO there, where what we actually do is reinforcing the informal sector. And we're making sure that they are self-sustained, that they are detached from the formal sector, because it actually helped with a country as big and as complicated as Egypt. And Lebanon's not that much different anyways. So I just wanted to say that actually celebrating informal sector is a solution that's been adapted in Egypt at least. Yeah.
But maybe it's only a second best solution.
This is the only answer we have. It's the only solution we have right now, of course.
Thank you. I would have two questions, or perhaps one question, one comment to Professor Robel concerning, we looked at Europe and here the Middle East. Could we perhaps have as well some lessons from the development of Asian countries in the last 40, 50 years as another role model? What did they do to improve in economic and wealth creation terms? And my observation, because I think this informal-formal thing is really crucial for you, the one question I would underline is informal sector doesn't mean something bad. It can as well prevent and give stability and structure to your society and your economy. So to lift from informal to formal can create as well new tensions and new problems. But my question would be, to you in Lebanon, which institutions, people, authorities, referees could be the one you can imagine that could lead such a dialogue from bringing informal structures into more formal sectors, could in a way frame this process that people on the street do trust them in managing this process. And at the end of the process, there would be an idea of where do you want to have Lebanon in 10, 15, 20 years from now? And or the other question would be, what would you think that we both should take away to Germany? And when we are asked, what is the main thing you have in mind when you speak about Lebanon and Lebanese people? These are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items we should advocate from your point of view. And that could as well lead such a dialogue process in where do you want, what do we want to become as Lebanese economy, society, democracy? What are these, whom do you trust in a way?
So I will try to answer your question to me about Asian development models. I think we have to distinguish between the Chinese model, the socialist market economy, and the tiger states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on. And first I have to mention that all these models are characterized by a quite strong state. And the strong state is cooperating with the economic sector. For example, in South Korea, we have the chaebol, or in Japan, the keiretsu, the large conglomerates, and there are very strong relations between politics and the economy. And we have also, in all these countries, inclusive China, something like a development dictatorship, or we had a developmental dictatorship, for example, in South Korea under President Park in the 1960s and so on. And this model is, of course, very important and very interesting to observe. But here in this region, I think you are suffering from weak states. That's the main reason why you need informal institutions to compensate the functioning state. And from my point of view, it's senseless to watch Eastern Asia with a strong state as a model for this region, where the state is very, very weak compared to Europe and also to East Asia. So from my point of view, I think the Western model, the social market economy, is a better approach for this region than the East Asian model. Of course, in other countries in Southeast Asia, the Asian model is the main model, and also for maybe a few countries in Africa, like Zimbabwe or other dictatorships, this Chinese model is of highest interest. But in these countries, we have quite strong states which are able to carry through measures the politicians decided. And I don't know whether we can talk about such a strong state here in the case of Lebanon. And the second question was to the public.
I'd just like to try to answer briefly. I think the last part of your comment on trust actually was the point that the Lebanese need to reconfigure. I don't think Lebanese at large still have trust with existing institutions or the ruling elites. And that's what we are seeing now in the streets, the social movement that started against the incapacity of the Lebanese government to deal with the garbage crisis is, as a matter of fact, a sign that the Lebanese at large, even across all the sectarian communities, are actually fed up from the corruption that's, has been at the level of state, or the inability to enact the right policies and come up with the right solutions. So this is actually the essence of the problem, the lack of trust between the Lebanese at large and whoever is ruling them, regardless of their... Now, this sometimes can be, taken in certain direction when it comes to the sectarian identity, but at large, I think the Lebanese have minimal trust in their ruling elites. And this has actually erupted in quite interesting and hopefully influential movement that we're currently seeing. Now, who's the referee? I don't see any referee at the moment. It's perhaps civil society reconfiguring its role, coming up with a new social contract, I guess, that might become the base for a new referee. But I might be wrong. Maybe other colleagues might have other ways. What do you think, Aline? So we leave it to see the outcome of this movement. And I think many Lebanese are optimistic about it. Any other questions? Yes? You had your... so now you can introduce yourself.
I'm the wrong one to ask about the Lebanese view, because I'm actually also from Germany, but I studied here at AUB. And I just, over the last 4 years I have lived here, I think, it's my opinion, I realized more and more that I think Germans living under these conditions here would actually act the same way as the Lebanese do. This is what I want to say, that it's really the environment and the conditions that form us and the way we are living. And this is one point I want to make. The other one related to the garbage crisis and to the elites in this country and to the belief and the trust in the state. I make an interesting observation in Lebanon, and it fascinates me and it worries me, is the belief of the Lebanese in privatization, that privatization is the solution for everything. And it stems from this absolute distrust towards the elites, but the critical point is, I think, the realization the elites are the state in this country. And I also wonder how should you get the trust into the state when you have to completely distrust these elites, and this is something I just observe, but I don't know the solution for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can summarize it with the words of Achimolo Robinson: institutions matter at all. Or last but not least, maybe it's not the culture or the geography, but simply the institutions in one country which form the population and the other rules in the society.
Any last comment? Okay. So thank you very much for being here in this exciting conference. I think we learned a lot today, and thanks for all who presented, but also thanks to Leila Qabalan, the program coordinator in our Institute of the Social Justice and Development Policy. This is our one of our impressive programs. So thank you, Leila, for organizing this, and thanks to our colleagues, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, for being our partners and for continuing to be our partners in the coming future. We're actually looking forward to a lot of cooperation and collaboration with CAS to continue to do some exciting work and bring some colleagues from Germany to share their ideas, their scholarship, and so on. So thanks to all, and just to mention that our social media team has uploaded all of this in the biosphere, in the blog sphere, everywhere, so you can go and check it out over YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. So if anyone who missed any part of this, you can still go and log on and see it. Thank you very much.